Hello and welcome to Dinis Guarda YouTube podcast show. Once again, profiling the global leaders and the personalities that are shaping the world we live in, especially when it comes to technology and business and all the major challenges that we're facing as well, but the opportunities. In this podcast show, powered by businessabc.net, citiesabc.com, wisdomi.ai, and sportsabc.org, we've been looking at the biggest challenge that we are facing as humanity, as society. And we've been actually having a lot of different thought leaders, personalities, technologists. And today I think I bring one of the most fascinating personalities that I've been actually perplexed and as well puzzled with all the work that this personality has been doing, but as well about the fundamental risks and the opportunities that we have when it comes to the areas of tech, cybersecurity, and all the industrial infrastructure of counter extremism and governmental transparency. So I welcome to our series, Emily Crose. Emily is an expert and I would say a global authority on tech, cybersecurity, industrial infrastructure, counter extremism, and government transparency. With over more than 10 years of experience, she's an ex-CIA, National Security Agency, and the United States Army Intelligence and Security Commander, infosec specialist, and she's been as well serving in the U.S. intelligence community for 7 years before entering the private sector. So at the moment, she is the co-founder of Hacking History, a project investigating the United States government handling of the hacking community. She regularly speaks and teaches on the topics of privacy protection, the potential risks of cyber war, and some of her notable presentations including titles and topics like Blood in the Wires, What Does Cyber War Look Like, and Intelligence Democratize, How We All Participate in Modern Intelligence Operations, Economic Espionage, and How Worried Should We Be About Cyber War. She's as well an expert educator and trainer, and their presentations offer actionable learnings around privacy protection as well as potential cyber war threats. We're going to be talking today as well about a recent book, which I'm very excited to present. That is The Hack to the Future, and is published by Wiley. It was recently in October 2024. And in this book, Emily delves into the intricate relationships between agriculture and the United States government over the past few decades. So there's a lot of different things here to talk. I think just as a final note, Emily is also an advocate for LGBT inclusion and speaks about the importance of diversity in the tech industry. And as a transgender woman, Emily shares her experiences in the male-dominated workplaces, highlighting the issues faced by women, especially transgender women in these environments. So there's a lot of topics here just in this intro. It's a pleasure and honor to have you here, Emily. Welcome to this series.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this.
So I think your profile is amazing, but as well it's very powerful because you've been dealing with probably the most sensitive topics in the world. And at the same time, keeping your personal integrity and your personal identity and gender in the areas, which is very special and very, I would say, quite unique because most of the people are afraid when it talks about all these different topics that I just read. So I would like to start about your history, how you end up actually working for the CIA and for the most powerful agencies of intelligence in the world, but how you kept as well this kind of integrity, which I admire, and as well a sense of activism, but as well a sense of honesty and transparency, which is more important than ever.
Yeah. So I joined the intelligence community in the United States right after leaving college. So it was something I went to through my university, had a program that's sponsored by the National Security Agency. It's called a Center of Academic Excellence. So we had, didn't really know anybody personally who sponsored that program at the university, but it just seemed like a good pathway for me to take after my university education. So I went and worked for the National Security Agency as soon as I left college around 2010. That's when I started there.
I would like, before even going into that, so during your education before, did you, I don't know if you would go back to your childhood, would you think that you would actually end up actually working in cybersecurity and all these topics that you are right now? Because I like always to see from people listening to us, there's demystifying yourself, but as well your achievements with your background.
Yeah, that's a funny question. If I could go back to my high school days, I probably wouldn't have imagined taking that path. Despite the intro, the very detailed interview or introduction that you gave me, I don't really think of myself as a particularly special person in any way. So going down that path is very interesting in retrospect, and I wouldn't trade it because those experiences were very valuable to me. But I definitely would never have considered that I was, smart or talented enough to go down that pathway. But it's definitely
Well,
a privilege.
well, definitely you are very smart, and what you achieve is very special as well. So I think cheers to that, and kudos, because it's not small task what you achieved, and as well I think it's very important because you are a doer, and as well your work speaks highly, and as well a very down to earth, which I admire even more. But so I want to touch, so from, you mentioned, so from college and from university you end up actually working, of course, for the biggest intelligence organization in the world. And of course, I'm not going for all the innuendos that you had there, but tell us a bit about that experience, both, and they work actually for both CIA and the NSA, which are probably not the problem. They're the biggest intelligence agencies in the world. And people are used to look at these in James Bond films, but the reality, like you said, is more down to earth, and there's a lot of details. So I would like to demystify that work, of course, whatever you want to put public. And as well, from that experience, then we went to the private sector.
Yeah. So broad strokes, I think the general idea that people have about intelligence and the way that it works is very different from the way that it does work in reality. It is a bureaucracy. It's a bureaucracy that exists in several countries. It's not unique to the United States. And it ultimately is, it's a game that countries around the world play with each other. So in that way, it's a lot less mystical than you'd think from watching movies. But there are some things that are more true to life than more true to life in reality than you would expect, even in some fiction, some far-flung fiction. So there are interesting nuances to the way that some countries do it versus others. Probably one of the most interesting things that I learned is just how the sorts of techniques and areas of interest that intelligence communities engage with is very side by side with the rest of the world that we kind of see in day-to-day life. A lot of the people that are just like me who worked in the intelligence community, they still go to the grocery store. They still drive their cars on the same roads we drive on. So in that way, it's a bit like a subset of the world that exists in a way that we can kind of see when you're really looking for it, but in other ways is imperceptible if you aren't really engaged with it. So it's fascinating to be able to see those markers even now when I'm kind of just out in the world and notice something that, hey, that looks like something I remember. But most folks won't see it if they're not looking for it.
So tell us a bit about the work. So what it is to work, because you're dealing with the most dangerous things that humanity is facing, from cyber war to industrial infrastructure hacking, counter extremism, and all of this. Just each of them is probably a podcast in itself. But I was to work on a big intelligence agency, or the biggest in the world, on these topics, and I'm sure, I don't know if you want to share any kind of, without going directly to details, any risk that you had to dismantle, any big thing? Because of course, I think most of the people, like you said, we drive our cars, we go to the supermarkets, but we're not seeing what people like you are doing to protect us. And there's of course, there's only a small fraction of some crazy people in the world. I think most of the humans want just to live their lives, but there's some crazy people still out there. So I would like to hear a bit some of this experience, and as well whatever topics you want to highlight with this cybersecurity, in particular, cyber war and industrial infrastructure and counter extremism related to hacking.
Yeah, sure. So things like counter extremism are that item in particular is an ever evolving threat. It's not a thing that just exists in one form forever in the exact same way. There are markers that are similar between cases. So take like Al Qaeda, for example, has a lot of markers in common with other groups that came later, like ISIL or ISIS. I mean, both of those are kind of similar groups in and of themselves, but their ideologies are slightly different as well. So it's kind of up to the government intelligence agencies working in tandem with military organizations to identify those sources of extremism and do something about it. So what they do about it really varies from target to target. In some cases, you might have a mission that ultimately ends with the capture or in some cases, the killing of like a terrorist leader. We've seen this several times throughout the last 20 years. And so there is an entire, before you can even get to like a bin Laden raid, for example, there's a lot of intelligence work that needs to be done leading up to those sorts of raids. And part of that, especially in the last, let's say, 20 years, pretty solidly 20, 30 years, has been due to signals intelligence, or what we call SIGINT, in the intelligence community. And a new component of that, or a newer component of signals intelligence, is what I do, which is computer security. Offensive computer security is one component of that. We try to grab intelligence off of computers. So that has been an even more quickly evolving part of the intelligence community and the intelligence collection process over the last, like I said, 20 years.
And so from that work, and I think, of course, there's a like I said, there's a bureaucratic part, which is what saves us, because in the end of the day, this bureaucratic part is not. I know that now bureaucracy, the name in itself is very scary, but at the same time, we need to have process, we need to have structures, and we need to have as well ways of putting all of these things together. So from the work that you've been doing on this, I would like to touch more. Of course, there's always the part more sensationalist of one big case that you had to deal, or normally is a team. But I would like to touch, for instance, the hacking community is massive worldwide. And of course, there's white hat, black hat hackers. So a bit of, if you can probably, and you are as well an educator, so a bit educate our audience around how big this is and how important this is to us, because of course it's invisible. Most of people are not conscious how important this is. I would like for you, if you could explain a bit what you are doing and how it works then from the different communities around these areas.
Yeah, so different agencies work in different ways. So in the United States, we have three-letter agencies: FBI, NSA, CIA, and they all have requirements for intelligence collection. Most of those requirements come from either military sources or other U.S. Legislative sources. For example, even the president can have requirements for military or for intelligence collection. So they may have like a broad requirement that we have a need for, let's say, nuclear proliferation material. So we want to know everything about the identified proliferators of nuclear materials, what they're doing with it, who's transferring it, who's producing it. And so then it's up to the three-letter agencies, the intelligence community, to gather as much intelligence about those areas of interest as they can using the techniques that they have available to them. So a lot of it is, hey, here's the thing we need, pass it on to the people who can get that information. We give you the blessing to go find it, whether that means talking to an individual, getting it through what we call human intelligence or humans, or hey, we think that they may be transferring information over a signal-based device or a computer. So if that information lives on a computer system, send it to a different three-letter agency, and then they go and get it. So it's a sort of complex web of needs and providers of information. So it's very simple when you break it all down into those sorts of containers. And then, of course, once you get the raw information, you have to send it to people who can piece the entire picture together. So the analysts that work within the intelligence community, some of them are empowered to piece those puzzle pieces together based on several different sources and produce an intelligence report that is synthesized from the all of the reporting on signals collection and human collection and satellite imagery and all of that, so that they can make it very simple for decision makers to consume that information and then make a choice that really impacts everybody on the globe.
So I want to nail a bit more on what you just said. So at the moment, so from the work with the governments and the agencies just mentioned, there's as well, of course, the world out there. So you have the general kind of operations infrastructures that we have, the technology infrastructures. And then there's the white hat hackers that are the ethical hackers a bit like you, that are security experts and specialists that are authorized to find and fix vulnerabilities in systems. And then there's the black hat hackers that, of course, they have a lot of malicious intent, a lot of different things. And you have even kind of gray hat hackers and so forth. And the numbers are quite big, because we're talking about, I think the numbers was around, from a vulnerability, this is for data from 2024, we're talking about potential over 1 million people involved on this. I think it was the numbers more or less that we have. So it's quite, but for instance, then from these numbers, we have, like, for instance, some of the most expensive and issues are about around the infrastructure for healthcare, which with some data breach costs can be going to billions and billions of dollars. And this can be for healthcare, financial industry, and of course, infrastructure. And you touch, of course, things like security of weapons and so forth. So from that experience that you had before you went public or private career, tell us a bit, how does the U.S. government, in this case, these agencies, of course, in a very top level, I'm not going to display anything here, but what is the procedures for people that don't understand so much, but my audience is quite technological savvy? The guidelines, top level guidelines that people do when dealing with these black hat hackers and white hackers, and some of the experience, if you want a case study that you want to display with the audience as well.
Yeah, sure. So there's differences between those three groups that you mentioned. Typically, when we talk about white hat and black hat hackers, and really all three groups, the difference is authorization, like getting the right permissions to do the things that you are trying to do. So the most basic difference between white hat and black hat hackers is that one group, the white hat hackers, typically have like a full, a formal permission-based system that they use. They have a scope, they have signed contracts, and they have goals in mind that benefit the folks that they sign the contract with. Black hats, on the other hand, sort of make their own rules, and they don't ask for permission when they do their work. So if we really boiled it down to just the most basic differences between those two groups, it would be along the lines of authorization. So your gray hats kind of live in the spaces in between. I think of gray hats more as people who either don't get permission or don't have a narrow enough scope. Maybe they do have permission, but the permission only goes so far. Or maybe they didn't get permission, but they have a very specific goal in mind. They're a little bit more of an elusive group to pin down, because lots of people find themselves, unfortunately, in the gray hat box, even unintentionally, coming from like ethical hacking, because the lines get a little blurry in certain spots. And that's one of the things I actually talk about in my book, is how we get to an order where hackers fit into a global context of a legal framework that applies to at least everybody who falls within the Western sphere of influence. And that doesn't really happen until like the mid 80s. But we've seen this growth of the permission structure, I think, since the early 90s, that it really defines where we are now over a 30-year period of time.
And do you see right now, from what is happening around, from your experience, I want to go to the book in a while, but I want to keep a bit of this introduction. So from your work experience still within these big organizations, did you find a balance on this, or there would be, I would say, like a disturbance of the force, if you use the metaphor of the Star Wars. There was a lot of disturbance. How do you see the balance that we have here? Because of course, I think especially the last 5 years, there was not like besides COVID-19, there was not like a massive meltdown of financial systems or things like that. But the fact with the COVID-19 and the US elections and even the Brexit were quite sensitive in terms of data, privacy and all of things, although we kind of forget it. But there are things very sensitive. I would like just to hear, how do you see that part? Because I know that your book touches a lot of these things, but I want to come back in a second level just before we go to the book.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that the government authorized hackers kind of fall outside of the normal framework that we use for white hat and black hat hackers, or at least in my opinion. I'm sure that other people have different options on this, but depending on whether you are being hacked or you are the hacker in a context of like a nation state offense and defense, you probably would define like an NSA computer operator differently based on your own context in the world. So a target of NSA is probably going to feel that an NSA officer is probably a black hat, right? But in the context of American law, they would fall pretty squarely in the white hat hacker category because they've been authorized to do all of this. Now that's a legal framework, so it's a little bit different than a moral and ethical framework that you might otherwise use to judge these actions. I sort of don't really see the overlap between the two, just because of the wild variance that you have in like targets of nation state hacking and outcomes. So I think it's really difficult to sort of unify those two principles and make a determination about who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. I don't think it's quite so simple.
No, that's an interesting point. So there's a bit of a blurred line on these things, from what I'm hearing. Wow, that's that I would not understand. I'm trying to digest. So from this angle here, so when you left the CIA and NSA, you co-found Hacking History. So tell us a bit about that way of living these two agencies and why you create the Hacking History and why you decided to get this project that is investigating the government handling of the hacking community. I think probably the first question is, when do you start getting into the hacking community as you left, of course, the CIA and the NSA?
Yeah, so I'd been a member of the hacking community since I was in high school. So I've been affiliated with the community for a very long time. Even before going and working for the government, I had been interested in what makes computers work and what makes them not work. So for a very long time, I've been a student of this discipline. What made me interested in doing hacking history is a sort of, but also sort of not related story. So after I left government, I took interest in this history of how people end up in government service from the community that I come from, knowing the roots of a lot of the people who I interact with in the hacking community and how they make that decision to go into government service. Now, I had like a different pathway than a lot of, especially previous generations of hackers moving toward government service. But that is a very long and rich history that we discover more facets of as we ask questions of the government and get answers over a very long period of time. So the Hacking History Project, just to explain it briefly, is a project that involves us putting in Freedom of Information Act requests to various government agencies about individuals and actions, sometimes hacking tools, asking agencies like FBI, CIA, and NSA to basically give us the documents that you have on these things. And we'd like to just kind of see what the story is from the government perspective. We can talk to people within the hacking community that are still around these days and ask them how things worked back in the 90s and 80s. But those stories from government are much more difficult to tell because They're often hidden behind classified headers and classified document markers that require an official release and review process before you can legitimately get a hold of them. So that process for like top secret information, for example, takes 30 years, and we can have extensions on that take even longer. And then there's also a bureaucracy to releasing these documents as well, which just takes a very long time. So I can ask a question to a three-letter agency, and it may take 5 or more years for us to get an answer back. And sometimes the answer is really interesting. Sometimes documents are very, very rich in detail, and other times they just do what we call they give us a GLOMAR response, which is the classic, I can neither confirm nor deny the presence of this information. And that's usually a tantalizing sort of hint that there's something there, but you really can't read much beyond that, unfortunately. Usually that just means you're going to have to wait a little bit longer until we'll release this information.
So you are as well a senior technical director at Sophos Labs, and you work with Linux runtime threat detection. So can you tell us about that work? And then I want to deep dive into the book, but I would like to contextualize this for our audience as well.
Yeah, so I'm working for the Sophos company right now. I'm a technical manager working on finding threats to Linux environments. So we're trying to identify those markers of breaches that are more behavior based rather than like a traditional AV signatures. We also have products that do that as well, but my team is focused on developing kernel level detection. So if you were to use a specific tool on a victim's machine, regardless of what that tool is, some of those behaviors will be the same, and we'll be able to identify some of those markers at the kernel level that help us identify that behavior may be unwanted. So that's what we do in my division right now.
Well, it's a very important work that we all need to take. So now going to the book. So the book is Act to the Future, Our World Governments Relentless Pursue and Domesticate Hackers. So the book is extraordinary because in the end of the day, you actually explain the history of hacking. And at the same time, you contextualize in the case of the United States and in the case of international as well, but especially in the United States. And you put the last 50 years and as well from the different chapters. So you go from the pre-world brand era to the subculture explain, United States and technology to commercializing technology. There's a fantastic education. So I urge people to talk, to read it and to rethink, because there's a big things here. So I would like to, a bit to people listening to us, of course, the best is to buy the book and read it. But what would be the main area that you have here? And probably starting with the first one, I have multiple questions here, but the first question is, on the last 50 years of subculture of the hackers, of the hacker community, how do you see that it progressed? And a bit of historical part, if you want to summarize, to give a bit of display about the book.
Yeah, that's the big question. That's the big question I was trying to answer. So every history that I've seen on hacking community always been very US centric. So what are American hackers doing and how has that impacted the world? And I think that's, it's fine. But I think that I knew before writing the book that there was more to the story, and I wanted to answer some of those questions because I honestly didn't know going into this book what was happening in other countries at the same time, in the same time period that we often talk about hackers starting to emerge and the impacts that they have. But I knew that technology didn't exist in a vacuum in the 1970s. Like other countries had a lot of these similar technologies, and what were those countries doing with it? So trying to figure out how we built a global infrastructure for hackers to exist within, a global context for this sort of niche interest to grow within, and then ultimately become a party to geopolitics, really, like at a wide scale, is something that I really wanted to learn more about. So, like I say in the conceit of the book, it takes about 50 years for this sort of weird, like misfit group of hackers to go from freelancing to becoming resources that the government actively seeks to recruit. And there are some markers along the way that really lay out in clear detail how the government was looking at hackers. In the 1990s, for example, we go from recognizing hackers as this sort of like outlaw group that the law needed to do something about in the early 90s to the mid to late 90s, is starting to bring hackers into answer questions to Congress in the United States, and looking outwards into other countries, how to help other nations begin to see technologically inclined people and hackers specifically as folks who have information that can help the government rather than just be considered targets of legal persecution. So, yeah, it's a long history, but short when you think about it in terms of other groups that have gone from outlaws to more accepted, more culturally accepted forms of social norms.
So from this history, so one thing that I love about the book is amazing education. So you have from the retelling of the story from 903, story of the magician Neville Maskelyne, and how his life disruption of demonstration of Marconi's radio system, until the hackers go mainstream on chapter 9, that is in the 80s and 90s. And as well, they came to the probably popular imagination with films and mainstream films, that from Matrix to a lot of others. So let's go through this beginning, which is actually, in the end of the day, you start not the last 50, you start actually the last 120. So a bit your research on the history of hacking, I'm sure you find a lot of fantastic cases, but for people that are not so cautious about how this has been influencing a lot of different things, because of course this started not only even before the internet with the radio, and of course the spying world has been as old, I say that is the oldest profession in history. So if you can highlight a bit how your research brought you into seeing hacking in the present time.
It's always a hard thing when you're writing a history to figure out where to start. And so starting with Neville Maskelyne, I thought was a new and interesting way of looking at hackers as a group of people who have been here for a lot longer than we typically think of. I think most histories would start in the 1970s. So I tried to start it a little earlier. And yeah, and like I said, kind of think about them less in terms of a Western context and more in terms of a global context. Like certain societies, and something I was interested to find, in certain societies had a more robust framework for how to for allowing hackers to take root in their social aspects more so than others. So Germany, for example, is one culture that, despite being split during the Cold War, had a very strong presence of folks just like phone phreakers in the United States. There's a direct line of those same types of individuals that you can draw a line through to West German hackers, a very, very talented group of people, very influential in Europe. And similarly, there was also a very healthy scene in Melbourne, Australia, where a lot of the Australian hackers lived and kind of came up in. So that was one of the more interesting things I learned in this research, was just understanding less of this localized context of just these 50 states and how hackers grow across the world, not just in one specific context.
So, of course, when you talk about global hackers, I have to talk about Anonymous. So I would like for you to just elaborate, of course, whatever you want to go, because being part on the community, you have access to a lot of information. Of course, when we look at this, they're probably the most powerful organization, at least mainstream knowledge. So I don't know if you want to share any kind of the organizations that are, I'm not talking probably, now I'm going a bit more of the mainstream perception of hacking, but any kind of organizations you want to highlight how powerful they are, because now they've been kind of more discreet, but sometimes being discreet that there's been people are not doing. And of course, there's always a level of activism and a level of disruption. Do you think right now there's more stability, or there's less, but there's less perception on the public minds?
Anonymous, I think, is kind of the exception to the rule. Anonymous, of course, most prominent in the 2010s, probably most well known for being the largest group affiliated with hacking as a sort of technique or method for engagement. They grew a lot, I think, in part because of just media attention, and also just a free association that allowed them to kind of allowed anybody who wanted to claim an affiliation with Anonymous to make that claim and become a part of a decentralized group of people. It was a very attractive thing at the time that I think we have trouble seeing a replication of before or after. So what we had seen before the emergence of Anonymous as a group were like conferences, hacking conferences like DEF CON had come up in the 1990s. We'd seen groups like groups emerge in Europe that also were sort of built around the basis, like the same sort of basis, like the Chaos Computer Club, famously founded in part by Holland in Germany. And so even despite a community of people that was growing, Anonymous was sort of stood alone in its gigantic number of people that claimed to be a part of that group. So how has that changed over time? Well, I think it's hard to maintain a group that's that large and also keep a sort of face of legitimacy on an ongoing basis, right? So what we've seen is a sort of return to form with newer groups that are definitely still operating, whether they are operating in a more stable or unstable context. I think it's kind of hard to judge when it's right here in front of us in terms of timelines, but smaller groups, I think, have a lot of advantages over larger groups like Anonymous. For one, you have fewer people who are involved, so fewer people. If you're doing crimes, there's fewer people who could say that you worked with somebody. It's more likely that you won't get caught. It kind of gives you more flexibility in terms of where you can place your effort. So I think this is sort of the smaller hacking groups, more insular hacking groups is the sort of natural state now for those types of groups. It's sort of like outlaw hacker groups, if you will.
And it's really effectively, of course, a big part of what we perceive between the decentralized and the centralization, but as well the narratives around this. So I want to pick one of your stories that you have that was the story behind when your computer, when you were a teenager or during high school, that was infected with BO2 and how that influenced and your understanding of hacking. But I want to pass from that to the book, because in the end of the day, that is the hacking part, but as well the cybersecurity part. And of course, your book touches a lot of all these different areas. But I would like to do from that story to the research you did in the book. How do you see that? Because of course now children, if they put a normal teenage girl in school, will have other kind of cybersecurity challenge. We get it as well into AI. So I would like to pick that story, how you make the parallel between what you went through, and of course it shaped your understanding of hacking, but as well cybersecurity.
Yeah. Youth hackers have always been a thing. There's a sort of freedom that when you're learning complex things, it's good to be young. You can get away with more, and unfortunately, you also learn lessons the hard way sometimes. That was sort of like my story with Backorifice 2K, which is a very famous tool that came out around the year 2000, made by a very famous group of hackers that. Incidentally, I'm friends with several members of now the Cult of the Dead Cow folks. Even some of the developers of that her original tool, which is sort of like endearing to me personally, because I remember my experience with this when it came out, and so I had some friends in high school who we were all kind of learning off of each other, and I was kind of a latecomer to that group, and one of them gave me a disk with the files that they told me were that I should try and put them in my computer and play with them. And I self-infected with one of the victim executables that was in there. But that's what I mean. Like, learning the hard way is a part of the experience, I think. It's funny in retrospect but it's deeply embarrassing in the moment when it happens. So I'm going out on a limb here to tell you the story because it's definitely a source of gentle embarrassment for me now.
Well, I don't think it is because it made partly what you are today. I think it's the part, I think these stories are key for, and as well, I think for people listening to us, of course, our audience is not teenagers, but I definitely, this is a very important thing because you only learn with your mistakes. And especially when it comes to this, is quite important. So your book touches a lot of very high profile topics, and I want to be conscious of your time. So one of them is cyber war. Let's put it that way, or cyber war, depends on how you spell it. So how you see this, because it's probably one of the biggest challenges that you're facing right now between countries, and there's multiple implications from data privacy to economical and financials, but as well geopoliticals, and it's going to be. So can you highlight this about the life and death geopolitical conflict and how hackers and the implications on the cyber war?
Yeah, cyber war is an interesting concept because it is a sort of it's a topic that is sort of in the eye of the beholder. It's cyber war is what you make of what you make it. So there are incidents in recent history that we can look at and say, hey, that seems like it was an act of war, but we didn't really respond to it in such a way that you would if it were truly considered an act of war. So there are a lot of reasons for why that may happen in a geopolitical context. But when you take a concept like an act of war, for example, something that should be very black and white concept, if you drop a bomb on somebody's country, that's a pretty clear declarative statement for a war beginning. But with something like hacking, it's a bit more of a gray area. It's a little bit harder to define. So you could certainly claim that, for example, like the OPM breach of the United States from, nearly 10 years ago now, just about, we can identify the country that was behind it. We could identify that it was a big problem at the time, but we didn't go to war with China over it. So do we really consider it an act of war? I think it really depends on whether the government being attacked considers it that, right? So cyber war is a very misunderstood concept for that reason, but also it breaks down into several different sort of subcategories, I guess, of international violation. You can do things like espionage, for example, something that doesn't often result in loss of life. But would we contextualize that as cyber attack? Well, we certainly didn't with the OPM breach. So I guess in that way we didn't. But what if a nation were to get access to the electric grid, for example, which is what Russia did in Ukraine back in 2014, 2015 timeframe, and turn off the lights? Would that be an act of war? Well, again, Russia and Ukraine didn't go to war at that time over that action specifically. So even an attack on a bridge using electronic methods is not necessarily considered an act of war, at least by today's standards. So I think that may be a result of an evolving definition of what war looks like in the modern age. But it's certainly something that a lot of observers have a close eye on. It's something I pay very close attention to. It's an interesting thing that we are actively defining right now as we speak.
So, and you think that from that work, so like you said, what is an act of war and what is not an act of war? But there's a lot of disruption. For instance, we're talking about elections, we're talking about financial parts. There's a lot of things right now in terms of geopolitics, but especially when it comes to data and the privacy related to data. So there's one thing that you touch as well, but I think part of your work is, so if you look at the privacy and all the different parts that integrate part of the hacking culture, one of the biggest challenges we're facing right now is definitely our data being weaponized for a lot of things. And for instance, I know that you in your book, you touch as well the part of the LGBT and a lot of different things. So let's look at this part because it's a big topic of the privacy of data and the integration part of data in the hacking community, but as well in general in the cybersecurity general world that we live right now.
Yeah. So data privacy has always been a big issue, or at least it has since certainly since the turn of the millennium. I think people have been thinking about this, how it impacts them personally, but it's become very prescient, definitely in the last 15, 20 years, when we start to see these major breaches of credit agencies, for example. Identity theft has become a much bigger problem over time. So this has become a more topic that directly impacts people in ways now than it did in previous decades. So I think the interesting thing to me is to see how average people have reacted to that reality. And there's definitely a higher level of security awareness with people today than there was even 15 years ago. So people have become really used to the idea of protecting their information as much as possible. But the interesting flip side to that coin is that they've also become very used to having their personal information leaked through any number of corporate breaches that have happened over the last 20 years. So it's a bit of a frustrating situation for somebody who works in security like I do, because we try our best to protect this information, but ultimately it's not always up to us as individuals to protect that information. And often the people who we entrust with that information mishandle it or don't provide the same level of protective safeguards to it. So we all kind of live at the mercy of companies who, it's not really a major issue for them if they lose their entire customer database, but it certainly is a problem for all of us. And the way that they seen fit to respond to that in past years is to give us all a free year of credit monitoring, which I think most see as not quite enough for the level of trouble that it causes.
Yeah, it's kind of a more and more sensitive as well, because it brings a lot of levels. So coming into the levels of especially how the different parts of politics have been integrating, and how the kind of one of the things in your book is very positive at the same time, because it touches all these different things. But when I look at the world of politics and the world of using of hacking, and your book touches a lot of this and all the research that you do, how do you see this? Are you more optimistic? Are you more negative? How do you see this kind of impact and the different reactions based on your research and as well your experience?
We've made a lot of strides in the past 20 or 30 years on establishing what norms look like with regards to hacking and what the expectations should be from one nation doing it to another. So things like elections, for example, have become a flashpoint for this topic, because it seems to happen every election now. And what we expect as a society around that has also evolved. I know in 2016, U.S. elections seems to be based on investigative reports done by the government that there was some interference. The extent of that interference is, I think, been a matter for debate for quite some time. But the public's ability to understand that has at times been a little beneath what is needed to understand the context of those efforts, right? So in 2016, for example, Russian interference in U.S. elections was really more of an influence campaign than it was a direct effort to hack the vote, so to speak. So there was not enough, based on the information I've seen, enough effort that actually resulted in votes changing, which is a very different conclusion to come to than there's an ever-present campaign of influence happening throughout the world from one nation to another. It is influence. It could be considered interference, but how much that actually changes the outcome of an election is something that is very difficult to place. And I think the trouble is that it's become kind of murky. It's become a murky topic for most people to grasp and discuss. So it becomes hard to really have a discussion about what we need to do as a society in the United States to respond to that. And am I optimistic or pessimistic? I'm honestly, I'm pessimistic about the government's ability to respond to any crisis at the moment. My hope is that it improves, but we have several other areas that have required attention from our lawmakers for a very long time, and it's been woefully inadequate to actually solve many of those problems. So I would like to see more action there, more measures taken.
So one of the, I will quote from the book on the page 294. You have this part of the epilogue. You have a fantastic quote that I want to bring here. So a quote, fantastic writing. In the modern landscape of high-value corporate network breaches, new approaches have been imagined for how companies can and should respond to them. One idea that has gained some prominence in the last decade is opening legal pathways for companies to employ their own offensive hackers to hack back those who have attacked them. So this is a big area because, of course, now the biggest risk for a company, including my company, is the ransomwares, the DDoS attacks, which probably even OpenAI was victim recently, Microsoft. What you put here, of course, is probably what me as a company would want to do, but this implies that you have to have capacity of hacking, and in order to get into this, you imply that you have to be part of the community, and I would say there's probably 0.1% of companies that will have capacity for that. So how do you see this in a mainstream where the technology is going to be exponential, more powerful, and as well the hackers will use AI for doing a lot of this damage and all the different things?
Yeah, there's been some analysis on how AI has changed the offensive security space. I don't know that it's made a major impact yet, but that may change in 5 years' time or shorter time period than that. It's kind of hard to say as outlooks on that technology kind of ebb and flow. Certainly being able to develop code faster and change the functionality of code so that it appears different than it is in one version to the next, that could make a big difference. But for things like hackback, which I think it was what that quote referred to from the book, that's an interesting concept that I think the public hasn't really fully grasped. It's a very complex issue that can be broken down simply in that it's not a morally sound argument to hire a hacker to like go after somebody who's hacked you if you were a company, right? That's that there are a lot of complexities with doing that. Like how do you know exactly who it was with the nature of being able to reroute network connections? It can be really hard to figure out things like attribution for an attack, which is one of the things you would have to know to effectively do this. But one of the more interesting questions to me is what is the true level of corporate espionage that we have in the United States? Because I haven't seen a whole lot of sources of information that deal with that question. We certainly have plenty when it comes to nation states, but when it comes to one corporation going after another, is it possible that like ransomware actors, for example, is it possible that they've been hired as a part of a corporate espionage campaign? So they could be, mentioned this in a couple of different talks that I've given over the years. Is it possible that they could be considered doing like what we might call double dipping, where they get paid by one corporate entity to go after another to make money that way, but then they also make a second amount of money off of a ransom campaign, having the victim pay them. So there are a lot of interesting questions that I don't think we've caught up to in the public understanding of where hacking is right now. I'm interested to see how that overlaps, particularly over the next 10 to 20 years, in which case I may write a second book. I don't know. We'll see. But it's a very fast moving environment that is endlessly fascinating, but always disappointing. You can never have enough information, it seems.
Yeah, and I think you touch a very key element, because it's about how you bring this together, and especially how you push it forward. Because one thing And I think your book touches a very interesting thing, is that in the end of the day, and I will quote as well in the epilogue, the nature of modern hacking culture is more open, accepting, and supportive now than it has ever been before, which is quite a very positive thing. So on that, and I know I'm passing the time, so just two more questions if you have time. So, um, in so let's look at the ethical implications on hacking, but from a perspective of, and for instance, you have a very sensitive part towards, of course, the gender, LGBTs, and of course minorities, which is always a tricky part in any place. Well, in history of humanity is nothing new, but now we have as well other capacities. So these ethical implications, how do you see this in the hacking culture, but as well in I would say all the cybersecurity and all the education around this in general?
Yeah, the funny thing about the hacking community is that I think, in my experience, hackers have always seen each other as through a mostly an equal lens. Like, a hacker is a hacker. They judge each other more on what they know and they don't know. And it's historically, it's been a much harsher judgment than it is today. So, the bog standard, the bare minimum standard of knowledge used to be a thing that if you didn't quite need it, you would just be shunned by certain groups or made fun of by those groups for your lack of knowledge. I think there are more groups now that are more open and accepting to people who are learning and understanding, this person is just trying to learn the specifics of this thing, and it's not worth making fun of them for, because they may be the next person that you work with. So things like gender and sexuality haven't really been a major factor, or at least not something that has been highly exclusive in the hacking community ever, as far as I can tell. Which is a really welcome sign for a group that has mainly been considered misfits themselves. There seems to be a sort of common understanding that it doesn't really matter who you are, where you come from. If you're interested in learning, especially now, all of those things are vestigial. They're not as important as the interest and curiosity that you have. So I'm optimistic that things will stay good in that way into the future. And they've really gotten better, even in the areas that they may have been lacking in the past.
Well, that's a great thing that shows as well how open the community is. And I knew a bit, but it's great to hear that, and I like that we go in that direction. So I have two last questions. So the cost of cybersecurity is expected to reach 10.5 trillion annually by 2025, and partly will be due to AI enhanced attacks. So this is already more or less official data. So, of course, people listening to us, they're not experts like you. I'm sure there's a percentage of people that want to know, but what would be as an educator and as someone that is dealing with looking at cybersecurity for a living, how do you believe, or how do you suggest for people listening to us? Because one of the challenges I'm facing is there's a completely lack of digital literacy. And this is broader from children to adults, and the adults is even more alarming. But as well in major companies as well, even I can talk even my own company, the challenge that I have just for people to understand some of the terms, and people have all their expertise in it, and I'm in a tech company that builds AI. So I would just try to understand here, and even me, as one thing is me as an expert and as a technology builder, the other thing is the dealing with passwords, the dealing with a lot of things. But AI is going to enable this, because in the end of the day, any AI, especially these super AIs that we are building, and soon AGI, will know more about us than ever. And they can do anything. They can even manipulate us, which is probably my biggest fear. But well, listening, and it's a big question, but as someone that is dealing with this on a day-to-day, and as well looking at the numbers, which is almost 10 to 15% of the global economy, how do you see it, especially how can we protect ourselves, our families, our environments, and as well have a critic sense, especially my audience, because I expect them to be a bit more active. Because there's one of the things that I'm very concerned is the lack of people understanding how serious this is.
So my answer to that would be, folks have to have some level of awareness of what is developing what the cut, at least have a vague idea of what the cutting edge is, or at least know somebody who knows that, so that we can all better understand what our security exposures are. There is always going to be the compartment of technology and business that we can't control. So like who provides our power, who generates our electricity and distributes it to us, for example. Industry is one of those areas that we just can't control. And so AI may play a bigger role in those organizations as we, spend money to up our security game in those areas. Things are really only going to get more complex in terms of terminology and technology integration. So I for example, I have also co-founded a small company to try to figure out what some of these answers may be with AI, specifically when it comes to security. The company is called Neuralize.ai. And what we are trying to do is, hey, we have all of these, we have like logging, for example, is tons and tons of logs that are generated by businesses, like hundreds of gigabytes, terabytes of logs that are generated by large enterprises today. And understanding and being able to parse all of those logs is a very old problem at scale. But even when it comes to having a human analyst sit down and look at those logs and understand what they all mean can be a daunting task, even for somebody who's been in the industry for 15 years like me. So what I see AI as being able to do is to sort of fill some of those gaps as an assistive technology rather than something that can completely replace people. Especially if we have like a potential industrial accident, like the conditions for that forming. I can see artificial intelligence being an assistive technology to avoid those types of outcomes, or to even investigate problems, to shorten the duration of an incident report in the aftermath of a breach, for example. So there are areas that I can definitely see that technology being applied. Unfortunately, over the last year or two, in my experience, my observations, there's been a sort of critical slowdown in the macroeconomic, due to the macroeconomic conditions to fund new startups like this. So I'm hoping that picks up in the next year or two. But there's definitely room for growth there that I would love to see and be a part of.
Oh, so that brings me to the last question, and I wanted to touch this, but so one of the things you touch precisely in Neuralize.ai is that, and you touch partly, but I want to touch one of the things that you have. So you have the innovation part, which, like you said, there's a lot of opportunities, because normally I try to go through the risks, but I want as well to look at the possibilities. So there's AI analytics, AI protection, and even use the tools. Then you have Elevate Tech Stack. And one part that is very important is IP creation, which is one of the areas. So how do you see this? Because in the end of the day, one of the things that the hacker culture created was, he highlighted the problems, and of course it's super important to test. At the end of the day, the hacker culture is the testing culture of all our software and different things. But the IP creation is, because one of the challenges right now is how we can actually, on one hand, create innovation after AI is creating, the LLMs are mostly stealing everything and creating new levels, and as well, we create everything with AIs as well. And at the same time, first, one of the challenges, sometimes I think about this, okay, if I look at all the data that I put in ChatGPT or Claude or any other AI, they know everything about me, and they can actually even manage the way I write, how tense I am, how emotional I am, or if the questions I ask, and so forth. So how can we look at the IP creation? And I have a concept that I probably will provoke you as the last question. There's an IP that is our own personal IP, is our own data, our own kind of whatever we put online, and as well what we perceive ourselves. And the second part is, of course, the IP that we're creating with our business, our organizations, and even working within organizations. So I know that is a big question, but I know that you're a researcher. I want to push that as the last one. And as well, I think the hackers have a lot of knowledge because they know how to deal with all these different areas. I want to contextualize that on your hacking experience and the fantastic book that you did.
Just figure out. I'm sure that we're going to have landmark cases on this in the very near future. But we can also look to previous cases that I think are formative in trying to figure out, sort of pinpoint where we are on this technological journey. Of course, there was a famous one from decades past involving Andy Warhol and his copying of art and reproduction and kind of what that means for fair use, which I think plays a role in this. But it's definitely a thing that has been criticized, criticism that's been leveled at AI companies, how to deal with this stuff, the IP in terms of what's fair and what's not fair. To a lot of folks who create new IP, there certainly is a feeling of what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? If I create IP and a bigger company comes along and takes it for its own purpose, why can't I sue them? They would sue me if the roles were reversed. And I think that honestly, I think AI companies have a big job ahead of them to explain why that's morally and ethically acceptable. So I think it's a tough question to answer. It's a tough question to answer clearly, but it's definitely a problem that needs to be solved before we can see the sort of wide adoption and creation involving AI or a reproduction in some cases using AI that I think the original creators of that technology intended. So we'll see how it shakes out, but it may not be for another couple of years.
It's a big one. Yeah, I appreciate. So, Emily, it's been an honor to have you here. I know that we passed a bit, almost close to 1 hour and a half. So, for people listening to us, please get the book. It's a great history of the hacking culture of the 20th century. Well, the hacking culture, let's put it that way. But as well, it has, what I like is that you're quite positive, actually, much more than I thought. I would be probably more alarmist. And I like that level of very secure part that I think we all need. And as well, the book goes for a lot of things. Of course, I didn't want to go too much on all the details, but there's a lot of education here. And I think you're a great educator, actually. This is, I'm actually reading it and rethinking and putting a lot of things as my own educational. So for people listening to us, please hack to the future. We'll put a lot of information about the book. We'll have a separate Books ABC about the book. Emily, thank you so much for making this great amount of research. I'm sure we'll try to bring you more I'm doing a series of more in terms of cybersecurity hacking, the second of business, because it's one area that I always like to do, but very grateful for this fantastic research that I think it actually helps everyone in the world. Thank you.